A system doesn't fail twice in the same second unless someone wants it to. The receipt sat there, small and ordinary, yet impossibly wrong, and Sophia Bennett felt it before she understood it. The way her fingers paused just a fraction longer on the edge of the paper. The way her eyes returned to the timestamp as if it might change if she looked again. 7:42 p.m., table 16, printed twice, identical down to the cent, down to the last digit. And yet she knew she had only cleared that table once. Only watched one man sit there, one polished suit, one quiet conversation that never rose above a whisper, the kind of conversation that didn't belong in a restaurant, but happened there anyway. Hidden behind candlelight and soft music, she glanced up, the dining room glowing under warm chandeliers, glasses clinking, low laughter drifting. Everything normal, everything exactly as it should be, except it wasn't, because across the room Jonathan Hale sat at the center table. The kind of man people recognized without being introduced, his posture precise, his silver watch catching the light every time his hand moved. A man who lived in control, who trusted numbers, systems, signatures. And right now he was reviewing a contract thick enough to change someone's life by morning. Maybe thousands of lives. Sophia turned the receipt over, then back again, her breath steady but her mind already moving, connecting. The reflection in the polished spoon she had set earlier, the angle of the mirror behind the bar. The brief moment she thought she saw someone standing where no one had checked in, no reservation, no greeting, just presence, quiet and deliberate. She remembered the second glass of water that had been poured but never requested, the chair that shifted slightly without sound. Details so small they dissolved if you didn't catch them in time. But she always did, because Sophia didn't just serve tables, she watched patterns, and patterns didn't lie. She moved through the room now, calm, invisible, refilling drinks, adjusting plates, her eyes tracing the edges of reality itself, measuring what belonged and what didn't. Table 16 was empty now, clean, reset, waiting for the next guest. But the receipt in her hand said otherwise. It insisted that something had happened there twice, in the same minute, under the same name. And as her gaze drifted back to Jonathan Hale, she noticed the pen in his hand hovering just above the paper, the faintest hesitation before a signature, as if somewhere deep down even he felt it, that something wasn't right. Sophia exhaled slowly, the room quieting in her mind, every sound pulling back until there was only the soft ticking of time and the weight of a decision, because once she stepped forward, once she spoke, there would be no going back. The invisible would become visible, and the man who believed he controlled everything would have to face the one thing he never saw coming. The truth hiding in plain sight. The pen did not touch the paper, not yet, and Sophia saw it in the way Jonathan Hale's fingers paused, just a fraction of a second too long, as if instinct whispered something his logic could not explain. She stepped back behind the service station, placing the receipt flat against the polished surface, her eyes narrowing slightly as she traced the order code, the transaction ID, every digit aligned perfectly with the system's formatting. No glitch, no duplication error. This was not a mistake. It was intention. She turned her head just enough to catch the reflection behind the bar again, the long mirror stretching across the wall. And there it was, not a person, not fully, but the suggestion of movement, a presence that never directly appeared, only existed in angles, in reflections, in places where eyes rarely stayed long enough to notice. Sophia picked up a clean glass, moving with quiet precision toward table 16, her steps measured, unhurried, invisible in the rhythm of service. The table looked untouched, perfectly reset, silverware aligned, napkin folded, chair pushed in. But when she reached for the edge of the tablecloth, her fingers brushed something barely there, a shift in texture, a crease that did not match the rest. Someone had been here, not long ago. She straightened slowly, her gaze drifting across the room until it landed on the man seated across from Jonathan Hale, his smile controlled, his posture relaxed, too relaxed, the kind of calm that came from knowing something no one else did. And suddenly the pieces aligned. The second receipt was not for a visible guest. It was for the one who never checked in, the one who never needed to, because he was already inside the system, already accounted for in a way that bypassed every normal step. Sophia's heart remained steady, but her thoughts sharpened. This was not just about a hidden presence. It was about a hidden transaction, one that mirrored the real one, duplicating it, redirecting it. She glanced down at the receipt again, then toward Jonathan's contract. The numbers, the timing, the structure, everything pointed to the same conclusion. Someone was creating a parallel deal, one that would exist the moment he signed, identical on the surface, but controlled by someone else entirely. She exhaled slowly, her hand tightening slightly around the edge of the tray she carried, because now she understood the danger, not physical, not immediate, but absolute. Once that signature was written, there would be no way to separate what was real from what was inserted, and the man who believed he owned every outcome would lose control without even realizing when it happened. Sophia moved again, closer now, close enough to hear the low murmur of voices, to see the contract more clearly, to confirm what she already knew. The timestamp on the document matched the receipt exactly, 7:42 p.m., duplicated in 2 places at once. She stopped just outside the circle of their conversation, invisible as always. But this time she did not look away, because the pattern was complete, the truth fully formed, and the only question left was not whether she was right, but whether she would speak before it was too late. Jonathan Hale did not notice her at first, because men like him rarely noticed anything that did not demand attention. And Sophia understood that. She understood the rhythm of power, how it moved, how it ignored, how it assumed control was permanent. She stepped forward anyway, one quiet step into the edge of their space, her presence subtle but intentional. The conversation slowed, just slightly. The man across from Jonathan glanced up, his eyes flickering with something sharp, something aware, as if he had been expecting interference, but not from someone like her, not from a waitress. "Excuse me, sir," Sophia said, her voice calm, steady, not loud enough to interrupt the room, only enough to reach him. Jonathan turned, irritation first, the kind that came from being interrupted mid-decision. But it faded almost immediately when he saw her expression, because she was not nervous, she was not apologizing, she was certain, and certainty had weight. "Yes," he said, controlled, his pen still hovering above the contract. Sophia placed the receipt gently beside the document, aligning the edges with quiet precision. "This was processed at your table," she said, her eyes meeting his just long enough to hold the moment. Jonathan glanced down, his gaze scanning the numbers quickly, then again, slower this time. The timestamp, the total, the transaction ID, identical to what he had just reviewed moments earlier. His brow tightened, not confusion, not yet, but recognition that something did not fit. "We only had one order," he said, more to himself than to her. Sophia nodded once. "Yes, sir, that is correct," she replied, and then she waited, because the next step had to come from him, not from her. Across the table the other man shifted slightly, his smile returning, controlled, measured. "I am sure it is just a system error," he said smoothly, his tone easy, dismissive. But Sophia did not look at him. She kept her focus on Jonathan, because he was the one who needed to see it. "Our system does not duplicate transactions within the same second," she said quietly. "It prevents that automatically." The words settled into the space between them, heavier than their volume suggested. Jonathan's eyes lifted, meeting hers again, and this time there was no irritation, only calculation. Fast, precise, the kind that built empires. He picked up the receipt, holding it beside the contract, comparing, aligning, his fingers slowing as the pattern revealed itself. Same timestamp, same structure, mirrored entries that should not exist together. "What are you implying?" he asked, his voice lower now, sharper. Sophia finally shifted her gaze, just briefly, toward the man across from him, then back. "I am not implying anything, sir," she said. "I am pointing out that this transaction exists without a visible guest, and it matches the timing of your agreement." Silence followed, not empty, but charged, the kind that made the air feel thinner. Jonathan leaned back slightly, his pen lowering onto the table without signing, his eyes no longer on the paper, but on the man across from him, really looking now, not as a partner, but as a variable, an unknown, something that had slipped past his control. The man's smile tightened just enough to reveal the shift, subtle, but undeniable, and in that moment the balance changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, Because for the first time since he had sat down, Jonathan Hale was no longer certain, and Sophia Bennett, standing quietly at his side, had just taken control of the moment without raising her voice. Without forcing attention, simply by seeing what no one else had bothered to look for, Jonathan Hale did not speak immediately, and that silence carried more weight than any response he could have given, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table as his eyes stayed fixed on the man across from him. No longer seeing a partner, but studying a pattern, a calculation, something that had almost slipped past him unnoticed. The man leaned back slightly, maintaining composure, but there was a shift now, subtle, controlled, the kind that only revealed itself if you knew where to look. "If there is a concern," the man said smoothly, "we can review it after we finalize the agreement." His tone remained calm, practiced, but it was no longer leading the conversation. It was reacting, and that difference mattered. Jonathan did not respond to him. Not yet. Instead, he picked up the contract again, turning the page slowly, his gaze moving with precision, scanning not just the visible terms, but the structure, the timing, the sequence of execution. He had built his career on seeing what others missed, and now something was beginning to surface, something misaligned. "This clause," he said, quietly, almost to himself, tapping a section near the signature line. "It activates upon confirmation of transaction." He paused, his eyes flicking briefly to the receipt in his other hand, then back to the page. "But it does not specify which transaction." The room did not change. The music still played, glasses still clinked, but at that table everything tightened, focused. The man across from him smiled again, but it was thinner now, controlled, standard language. He replied, "Nothing unusual." Jonathan finally looked up, directly at him, and this time there was no trace of assumption in his expression, only clarity, sharp and unyielding. "No," he said, his voice low, steady. "It is very specific language." He placed the receipt directly on top of the contract, aligning the timestamp with the clause, specific enough to allow a mirrored transaction to trigger the same agreement. The words settled slowly, like pieces locking into place. Sophia remained still beside him, her presence quiet but undeniable. She did not need to speak again, because the moment had already shifted. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his attention now fully engaged. "You created a parallel entry," he continued, not accusing, not yet, but stating a possibility with precision, one that exists inside the system without appearing in the room. The man's expression held, but his eyes betrayed the smallest flicker of calculation, a recalibration. "That is a serious assumption," he said, still calm, but no longer effortless. Jonathan allowed a brief pause, just long enough for the weight of the situation to settle. Then he reached for his pen again, not to sign, but to place it deliberately down on the table. The sound was soft, almost nothing, but it echoed through the tension like a decision being made. "I do not sign assumptions," he said quietly. "I sign certainty." His gaze shifted, just for a moment, towards Sophia, acknowledging not just her presence, but her role in what had just unfolded, then back to the man across from him. "And right now," he added, "this is not certain." The silence that followed was different now, no longer passive, no longer comfortable. It demanded resolution. And for the first time since the meeting began, the outcome was no longer controlled by the one who thought he had designed it, but by the one who had simply paid attention long enough to see the truth hiding in plain sight. The air did not move, but everything had changed, and Jonathan Hale felt it in the quiet space between decisions where certainty used to live. His eyes remained locked on the man across from him, no longer measuring opportunity but intent, and for the first time, the question was not what he could gain but what he had almost lost. The man exhaled slowly, leaning back as if recalculating the room itself. "You are overcomplicating a simple agreement," he said, his tone still composed but missing the effortless confidence it carried before. Jonathan did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached for the receipt again, holding it slightly higher this time, studying it not as an anomaly but as evidence, his mind moving through systems, through safeguards, through the architecture he trusted. And then he saw it, not in the numbers, but in the sequence, the order of execution, the way a mirrored transaction could trigger a clause before the primary record fully registered, a shadow acting before the original. "It is not simple," Jonathan said quietly, more certain now. It is layered. He placed the receipt back down and tapped the contract once, firmly, but without force. This agreement does not activate when I sign. He continued, his voice steady. It activates when the system confirms a completed transaction, and you created one that completes first. The words landed with precision, not loud, not dramatic, but final in their clarity. The man's smile faded just enough to reveal what lay beneath. Not panic, not yet, but recognition that the structure had been seen, that the design was no longer invisible. Sophia remained beside the table, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, but her presence now carried weight, not as a server, not as background, but as the point where everything had shifted. Jonathan leaned back slightly, creating space between himself and the contract, between himself and the decision that had almost been made. If I sign this, he said, his gaze unwavering, the mirrored transaction executes first, triggering the agreement under your control, not mine. He paused, letting the logic settle fully into the silence. And by the time the primary transaction registers, the outcome is already locked. The man across from him did not interrupt, did not deny, because there was no easy denial left, only silence. And in that silence the truth became undeniable. Jonathan's hand moved away from the pen completely. Now, resting flat on the table, grounded, deliberate. You designed this to look like a partnership, he added. But it is a transfer of control disguised as timing. The words did not accuse, they revealed, and that difference stripped away any illusion that remained. For a brief moment no one at the table spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything had already been understood. The music in the background continued, soft and distant, the rest of the restaurant unaware that a decision worth millions had just been unraveled by a single detail most would have ignored. Jonathan finally shifted his gaze towards Sophia again, this time not as acknowledgement, but as recognition, a quiet understanding that the moment existed because she had chosen to see it, to follow it, to speak when it mattered. Then he looked back at the man across from him, his expression no longer uncertain, no longer questioning, but resolved. This meeting is over, he said calmly, not raising his voice, not needing to, because control had already returned to him, not through force, not through authority, but through clarity. And as the man across from him slowly leaned back, his composure intact, but his advantage gone, one truth remained unspoken yet undeniable, that the most powerful move in the room had not come from the man with the contract, but from the one who had simply refused to ignore what did not make sense. The chair across from Jonathan Hale scraped softly against the floor as the man leaned back further, creating distance without standing, as if stepping away without admitting retreat. His expression remained composed, but the precision in his movements had shifted, no longer controlled by certainty, but by adjustment. You are making a mistake, he said quietly, not as a threat, not even as a warning, but as a final attempt to reframe the moment. Jonathan did not respond immediately, his gaze steady, unshaken, because he had already moved past the point where persuasion worked. The structure had been revealed, and once seen, it could not be unseen. Sophia felt the subtle release of tension in the space, not relief, but resolution, the kind that followed truth. She stepped back slightly, returning to the edge of the room, her role complete, yet her awareness still present. The man across the table reached for the contract slowly, his fingers brushing the paper as if considering whether to take it or leave it. Then he stopped, withdrawing his hand just as deliberately. We can revisit this under different terms, he said, his tone smoother now, less confident, more careful. Jonathan allowed a brief pause before answering, not to consider, but to let the silence define the decision. There will be no revision, he said, calm and final, his hand moving to gather the documents, stacking them neatly, aligning each page with the same precision that defined his thinking. Anything built on hidden variables is not a negotiation, he added. It is a liability. The words settled with quiet authority, not loud, not forceful, but absolute. The man held his gaze for a moment longer, searching perhaps for hesitation, for doubt, for any opening that might still exist. But there was none, only clarity, and clarity closed doors more firmly than anger ever could. Finally, he nodded once, a small motion, controlled. Accepting what could no longer be changed, he stood without urgency, adjusting his jacket, his composure intact, but the advantage gone. As he turned to leave, his eyes flickered briefly towards Sophia, just a glance, measured, assessing, as if trying to understand how someone so invisible had altered everything. But she did not react, did not meet his gaze, because the moment was never about recognition, it was about truth, and truth did not require acknowledgement to exist. The man walked away, his presence fading into the ambient rhythm of the restaurant, conversations continuing, glasses clinking, the world outside their table unchanged. Yet something significant had shifted within it. Jonathan remained seated for a moment longer, his attention lingering on the empty chair across from him, not in frustration, but in reflection, calculating the gap between what had almost happened and what had been prevented. Then he exhaled slowly, a controlled release, before turning his attention to Sophia, really seeing her now, not as part of the background, not as a passing detail, but as the point where the outcome had changed. "You noticed something no one else did," he said, his voice quieter than before, no longer commanding, but acknowledging. Sophia met his gaze briefly, her expression calm, unchanged. "It did not fit," she replied simply, as if that explained everything. And in a way, it did. Jonathan studied her for a moment, not with suspicion, not with curiosity alone, but with respect forming where dismissal once existed. "Most people would have ignored it," he said, and Sophia gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Most people are not looking," she answered, her voice steady, not proud, not defensive, just true. The words lingered between them, carrying more meaning than their simplicity suggested. Jonathan nodded once, slowly, absorbing it. Then he reached into his jacket, not for a card, not for a gesture of transaction, but for something more deliberate, a decision forming not out of obligation, but recognition. And as he placed his hand back on the table, pausing just before speaking again, it was clear that the conversation between them was not ending. It was only beginning. Jonathan Hale did not rush his next words, and that alone made the moment feel different, quieter, more deliberate, as if the decision forming in his mind required space to settle properly. His fingers rested lightly against the table, no longer tense, no longer reactive, but controlled in a way that suggested clarity had replaced uncertainty. "Tell me something," he said, his voice calm, measured, not as a command but as a genuine question. Sophia remained still, her posture composed, her presence steady in the soft glow of the dining room lights. "When did you first notice it?" he continued, his eyes studying her, not to challenge, but to understand. Sophia did not answer immediately, not because she hesitated, but because she chose her words with the same precision she applied to everything else. "When it did not match," she said quietly, and the simplicity of her response carried more weight than a detailed explanation ever could. Jonathan leaned back slightly, considering that. The idea that something so significant could begin with something so small, a moment most people would have dismissed without a second thought. "A receipt," he said, almost to himself. "Just a receipt." Sophia gave a slight nod. "It was not the receipt," she replied, her tone even. "It was the pattern around it." Jonathan's gaze sharpened just slightly, interest replacing the last traces of tension. "Explain," he said, and this time there was no authority in the word, only curiosity. Sophia shifted her weight subtly, not stepping closer, not stepping away, simply grounding herself in the moment. "The timing was exact," she said. "The system does not allow duplication within the same second. So if it appears twice, it is not an error, it is a design." Jonathan listened without interruption, his attention fixed entirely on her now, the rest of the restaurant fading into background noise. Then the reflection, she continued, her eyes moving briefly toward the bar, toward the mirror, that had revealed what direct sight could not. There was movement where there should not have been, and a second glass that was never ordered. She paused, just long enough for the details to settle. "Small things," she added, "but they aligned." Jonathan exhaled slowly, not out of stress, but out of recognition, because he understood alignment. He understood how small variables, when connected, created outcomes that could not be ignored. You followed it, he said, and Sophia met his gaze. Again, calm, unwavering. I paid attention, she answered. Jonathan nodded once, slowly, absorbing not just her words but the mindset behind them, the discipline of noticing, of questioning, of refusing to accept what did not make sense simply because it was easier. Most people would have stayed out of it, he said, not as a criticism, but as an observation of reality. Sophia's expression did not change, but there was something in her eyes now, something steady and grounded. Most people are taught to, she replied, her voice quiet but clear. It is safer that way. The words lingered, not dramatic, not heavy, but true in a way that did not need emphasis. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his attention narrowing, because this was no longer about the contract, no longer about the deal that had almost happened. It was about the person standing in front of him, the one who had seen what others missed and acted without hesitation. And you are not, he said, not a question, but a statement. Sophia shook her head once, small, controlled. No, she said, and that single word carried with it a quiet strength that did not need explanation. Jonathan studied her for a moment longer, the silence between them no longer tense, but thoughtful, and then he reached into his jacket again, this time slowly, deliberately, pulling out a simple business card, placing it on the table between them, not pushing it toward her, not insisting, just leaving it there as an option. I think you are in the wrong place, he said, his voice calm, not condescending, not dismissive, but certain in a different way than before. Sophia glanced at the card, then back at him, her expression unreadable for a brief moment, as if weighing not the offer itself, but the meaning behind it, the shift it represented, the path it suggested. And for the first time since the night began, the next decision was not his to make, but hers. Sophia did not reach for the card immediately, and that hesitation was not uncertainty, but control, the kind that came from understanding that some decisions changed more than circumstances. They changed direction. Her eyes rested on the small rectangle of paper for a moment, taking in nothing more than a name, a number, a possibility, before she looked back at Jonathan Hale, her expression calm, unreadable. Why? She asked simply, and the question was not about the offer itself but about the reason behind it. Jonathan did not seem surprised by the question, as if he had expected it, as if he respected it. He leaned back slightly, giving the moment space instead of filling it. Because you see patterns, he said, his voice steady, not persuasive, not forceful, just clear. And more importantly, you act on them. Sophia held his gaze, absorbing the words without reacting to them. Because recognition was not new to her, only rare. There are people with degrees who would have missed what you caught tonight, he continued, his tone measured. And people with authority who would have ignored it even if they noticed. The statement settled between them, not as flattery, but as fact. Sophia glanced briefly around the restaurant, the familiar rhythm of movement, the quiet exchanges, the controlled environment where everything had a place and purpose, and yet she had always existed slightly outside of it, observing rather than belonging. This is where I work, she said, her voice even, not defensive, not dismissive, just grounded in reality. Jonathan nodded once, acknowledging the truth in that. Yes, he replied. But it is not where you think. Sophia's eyes returned to him, sharper now, more focused, because that distinction mattered. You are comfortable here, he added, because you understand it. But comfort is not the same as alignment. The words were not spoken quickly, not thrown out casually. They were placed carefully, like pieces in a structure that needed to hold. Sophia considered that, not reacting outwardly, but processing, measuring it against her own sense of reality, the quiet awareness she carried every day. And what happens if I am wrong? She asked, her tone unchanged, but the question carrying weight, because it was not doubt, it was responsibility. Jonathan did not hesitate. Then you learn, he said, simply. But if you are right and you stay here, you will spend your time ignoring what you already know. The answer was immediate, not rehearsed, not calculated for effect, but grounded in experience. Sophia looked at the card again, this time not as an object, but as a decision waiting to be made. Her fingers moved slightly, brushing the edge of it without lifting it from the table, the moment stretching just long enough to feel its significance. "You are offering me a job," she said, not asking, not assuming, just stating what it appeared to be. Jonathan shook his head once, a small, controlled motion. "I am offering you a conversation," he corrected. "The rest depends on you." That answer shifted something, subtle but real, because it removed pressure, replaced expectation with choice. Sophia's hand stilled, resting lightly against the table, her eyes lifting to meet his again, searching not for intent, but for truth. And what she found there was not manipulation, not urgency, but patience, the kind that did not need to convince, only to wait. The restaurant continued around them, unchanged, unaware, but at that table something quieter was unfolding, something that did not demand attention but carried weight all the same. Sophia finally picked up the card, not quickly, not hesitantly, just deliberately, holding it between her fingers for a moment before slipping it into the pocket of her apron, not as acceptance, not as commitment, but as acknowledgement. And when she looked back at Jonathan, there was no smile, no visible shift in her expression, only a calm steadiness that had been there all along. "I will think about it," she said, her voice quiet but clear, and in that moment the balance held, not tipped, not forced, just waiting for what would come next. The night did not end with a decision, and that was what made it matter, because real turning points rarely announce themselves. They settled quietly into the spaces between ordinary moments. Sophia moved through the rest of her shift the same way she always did, steady, attentive, invisible to most. But something had shifted beneath the surface, not in what she did, but in what she allowed herself to consider. Every table, every order, every passing reflection carried the same familiar patterns, but now there was a question beneath them, not what she saw, but what she would do with it. Across the room, Jonathan Hale remained seated for a while longer, not working, not checking his phone, just watching the rhythm of the place with a different perspective than when he had arrived. He had built his world on control, on data, on precision, and yet the moment that had changed everything had come from someone outside that system entirely, someone who had no reason to intervene except that something did not fit. Eventually he stood, adjusting his jacket, his expression composed but quieter, more reflective. He left without drawing attention. Just another guest walking out into the city night, but the absence he left behind felt different, as if a chapter had closed without needing an audience. Sophia noticed when he left, not because she was watching him, but because she noticed everything. Her hand brushed lightly against the pocket of her apron where the card rested, a small weight, barely there, but impossible to ignore now that it existed. Later, when the restaurant slowed and the last tables cleared, she stepped outside into the cool air, the city stretching around her in quiet motion. Streetlights reflecting off windows, distant traffic humming like a constant thought in the background. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the card, holding it between her fingers, turning it slightly under the light. The name, the number, nothing more, no promises, no guarantees, just an opening. She thought about the receipt, about the reflection, about the moment she chose not to ignore something that did not make sense, and how that single choice had changed the outcome of something far beyond her place in the room. Her grip on the card loosened slightly as she exhaled, not overwhelmed, not uncertain, just aware that the same attention she had always carried could lead somewhere different if she allowed it to. A car passed, its headlights briefly illuminating her face before fading into the distance. She slipped the card back into her pocket, not as a final answer, but as a decision still unfolding. Because some paths did not begin with a step, they began with a shift in how you saw the ground beneath you. And as Sophia turned to walk down the quiet street, her pace steady, her posture unchanged, there was one truth that followed her into the night, quiet and undeniable. That the world had not changed around her, but her place within it no longer felt as fixed as it once had. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the familiar rhythm of the life she knew, something new was already waiting, not calling out, not demanding to be seen, but existing patiently, the same way truth always did, until someone chose to notice it.